All right, so we're diving deep into habits today. You sent over these excerpts from The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, and wow, I gotta say, I am hooked already.
It's really amazing how much these subconscious patterns really run our lives.
Yeah, and he talks about this thing called the habit loop,
Right.
and it's this three-step process, cue, routine, reward that explains how these things get so ingrained in our brains.
Yeah, the interesting part is so much of it happens subconsciously,
Yeah.
right? Happens in a part of our brain called the basal ganglia. It's like our autopilot, basically. It helps us conserve mental energy because, let's face it, our brains are busy.
Yeah, they are. So it's like our brain is running a program and we don't even realize it.
Exactly. Like even something as simple as brushing your teeth. You see your toothbrush, that's your cue. You pick
Yeah.
it up and start brushing. That's the routine, and the reward is that clean, fresh feeling. And after a while, the whole sequence becomes so automatic you don't even have to think about
It
it.
just
It
happens.
just happens.
That's wild. Okay, but then Duhigg throws this curveball with the story of Eugene, this man with amnesia who couldn't remember recent events or even draw a map of his own house.
Right. His case was truly groundbreaking for understanding habits, because even though he had severe amnesia, he could still do things like find the bathroom, go for his daily walk, things that he had done routinely before. It turns out that habits are encoded in our brains differently than our memories,
Wow, so even if the memories are gone,
even if the memories are impaired.
the habits are still there.
Exactly. And what's even more amazing is he was able to form new habits even though he couldn't remember learning them.
That is incredible. So there's clearly something powerful at play here, but what is it? Is it just about going through the motions or is there more to it?
Well, that's where cravings come into play.
Mm.
They're really the engine that drives this whole habit loop.
Mhm.
We don't just go through routines. We actually anticipate the reward. Think about the smell of freshly brewed coffee
Oh, yeah.
that triggers a craving for that caffeine kick and makes you way more likely to grab a cup.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like our brains are always looking for that little hit of dopamine, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's like a reward system built right in.
So it's not just about avoiding pain, it's also about seeking out those little bits of pleasure.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
there's actually scientific research to back this up. Studies with monkeys have shown that they'll choose juice that's associated with a particular cue, even over distractions like food or playtime.
So even when there are other tempting things around, they still go for that one specific thing because they've learned to crave it.
The anticipation is just that powerful.
That's amazing. Okay, so we've established that habits are powerful and we know how they form. But what if we want to break a bad habit? How do we actually do that?
Well, Duhigg talks about this golden rule of habit change. And it's based on the idea that you can't just simply erase a bad habit. You have to replace it.
So instead of trying to eliminate the habit entirely,
You'll redirect it.
redirect it. I like that. Okay, so let's say you're trying to quit smoking.
Perfect example.
You'd first identify your cues. Maybe it's stress, boredom, something like that. And then the reward is obviously that nicotine hit.
Yeah.
So how do you replace the routine?
You find something else that satisfies those cravings. Maybe it's chewing gum, going for a walk, even just taking a few deep breaths. The key is to keep the same cue and reward, but swap out the actual routine for a new one.
So it's like rewiring the habit loop.
Exactly. And by doing that, you're working with your brain's natural wiring instead of against it.
That makes a lot more sense than just trying to white knuckle your way through it.
That's way more sustainable.
Okay. But Duhigg also talks about the importance of belief in changing habits.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Knowledge alone isn't enough. You have to believe that change is actually possible.
So it's not just about knowing the steps, it's about having that internal conviction.
Exactly. He tells this great story about Tony Dungy, an NFL coach who transformed the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Mm.
And he did it by instilling this belief in his players that they could win by mastering just a few key routines. It wasn't just about changing plays. It was about changing their mindset.
So it was about creating a culture of belief.
Exactly. And that belief can come from different places. It can come from personal conviction, a supportive community, or even just seeing other people succeed with the same approach.
So it's like that saying, if they can do it, I can do it too.
It's a powerful motivator.
It really is. Now, another concept that Duhigg introduces is that of keystone habits.
Right.
These are small changes that can have a ripple effect across other areas of our lives.
Exactly. He tells the story of Paul O'Neill, the CEO of Alcoa, and his focus on worker safety led to these dramatic improvements in productivity and profits. It might seem counterintuitive, but by prioritizing one key area, he was able to unlock all these other positive changes.
So it's about finding that lever that can move a lot of other things into place.
That's a great way to put it. Keystone habits are all about shifting mindsets and organizational cultures. They create this foundation for other good habits to take root, and it's really amazing to see how one small change can unlock so much potential.
This is all so fascinating. But what happens when habits go wrong? You know, when those unconscious patterns lead to consequences that we never intended?
That's where things get a little bit tricky.
Right, because it brings up questions about free will and accountability.
Exactly. The book delves into some legal cases of sleepwalkers who committed crimes, and they argued that they weren't in control of their actions.
Wow, so if a habit is so ingrained that it overrides our conscious choice.
It raises the question of whether we're truly responsible for our actions.
That's a tough one. And the book also discusses the story of Angie Bachman,
Right.
a woman who gambled away her inheritance because of a gambling habit.
It's a tragic story, but it shows how powerful cravings and automatic behaviors can really be, and how they can sometimes spiral out of control.
So it's like there's this constant battle going on between our conscious intentions and those ingrained habits that can sometimes take over.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why understanding how habits work is so important, because it gives us the tools to manage those forces and make choices that are aligned with our values and our goals.
So this deep dive is really about shining a light on those hidden forces that shape our lives and helping us become more conscious of the choices we're making.
Exactly. We're just scratching the surface here. But hopefully you're already starting to see how understanding the habit loop cravings and the role of belief can really empower you to create lasting change in your life.
And maybe even unlock some of that hidden potential.
Exactly. Now, speaking of unlocking potential, let's talk about Febreze. It's a great example of how understanding the psychology of habits can be a game changer.
Febreze, I remember those early commercials. They were all about pet owners and smokers. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were trying to position Febreze as an odor eliminator, but it wasn't really working. The people who needed it most, those with consistently smelly homes, they often couldn't even smell the odors anymore.
So the bad smell wasn't strong enough to trigger the habit loop?
Right, and the reward in neutral smelling home just wasn't compelling enough.
It wasn't exciting enough to make people want to use it regularly.
Exactly. So they had to find a new way to activate that habit loop.
Mhm.
They had to create a craving that would drive sales. And the breakthrough came when they realized that people crave a sense of freshness and completion after they clean.
So instead of focusing on eliminating bad smells, they focused on creating a positive feeling.
Exactly. They reframed Febreze as the reward, the final touch that signals my cleaning is done and my house smells amazing.
So they changed the cue from a bad smell to the end of a cleaning routine. And the reward became that burst of fragrance, a signal that you'd really refreshed your home.
Exactly. And it worked. Sales skyrocketed because they tapped into that subconscious craving for a sense of completion and freshness.
That's a brilliant example of how understanding the psychology of habits can make or break a product.
And this principle applies to all kinds of behavior change, not just selling products. If you want to exercise more, eat healthier, be more productive, you name it. Understanding the habit loop is key.
So if we want to establish a new habit, we need to define a clear cue, a manageable routine, and a rewarding outcome that will create that craving.
Think of it like training a dog. You use consistent cues and rewards to shape the desired behavior.
Yeah.
Our brains might be more complex, but the fundamental principles are the same.
And just like with dog training, consistency is key.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can't just do it once or twice and expect to see results. It takes repetition and patience.
We were talking about the importance of belief earlier, and I think Tony Dungy's story really highlights that it wasn't just about telling his players what to do. It was about creating an environment where they believed in themselves and their ability to win.
He understood that you can't just expect people to change overnight. So he focused on making small adjustments, building on what they already knew, and gradually shaping their behavior into a more effective pattern.
It was like an upgrade instead of a complete overhaul.
Exactly. And he also knew that belief is contagious. So he created an environment where players felt supported and empowered, and that belief spread throughout the team.
And that's so important for any type of change, whether it's personal or professional.
Absolutely. You need to surround yourself with people who believe in you and your vision.
And speaking of community, Duhigg also talks about the role of social habits in shaping our behavior.
Right. He uses the example of Alcoholics Anonymous and its success in helping people stay sober.
And he argues that a big part of that success comes from the sense of community and support that AA provides.
Exactly. People feel like they belong. They have people they can rely on, and they're surrounded by others who are going through the same challenges.
So it's not just about willpower. It's about having a support system in place.
Absolutely. And that sense of community can be incredibly powerful.
It can make all the difference.
And this idea of social habits goes beyond addiction recovery. It applies to all sorts of social movements. Think about the Montgomery bus boycott. That wouldn't have been possible without the social habits that helped it grow.
So it wasn't just a few individuals deciding not to ride the buses. It was an entire community uniting and supporting each other.
Exactly. And that sense of unity and shared purpose was fueled by those social connections.
It's like that saying, united we stand, divided we fall.
Exactly. When people come together and support each other, they can achieve amazing things.
Absolutely. So if we want to create lasting change, whether it's personal or societal, we need to understand the power of social habits and leverage those connections to build a community of belief.
That's a great takeaway.
Now let's circle back to that ethical dilemma we talked about earlier.
About the limits of free will.
Yeah. What happens when those unconscious patterns of behavior lead to unintended consequences?
It's a tough question. And it really challenges our notions of responsibility.
The story of Angie Bachman and her gambling habit,
Right.
it really illustrates how cravings and automatic behaviors can have devastating consequences.
And then there's the story of Brian Thomas, the man who killed his wife while sleepwalking.
Oh, right.
It's a tragic case. But it raises these complex questions about the legal and moral implications of unconscious actions.
So if our actions are driven by forces beyond our control,
To what extent can we be held accountable?
that's a really tough question.
There are no easy answers. But I think the key takeaway is that awareness is crucial. By understanding how habits work, by recognizing the power of cravings and automatic behaviors, we can start to develop strategies for mitigating the risks.
So it's not about letting people off the hook. It's about understanding the factors that contribute to their behavior and creating systems that can help them make better choices.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that habits are powerful tools that can be used for good or bad. And by understanding the science behind them, we can use that knowledge to create a more just and compassionate society.
So it's all about finding that balance between individual agency and the influence of those unconscious forces that shape so much of our lives.
Well said.
This has been an incredible conversation, but we're just getting started. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how these ideas play out on a larger scale, examining the habits that shape our societies and even our world.
I'm looking forward to it. There's so much more to uncover about the power of habits and how they impact everything from our personal life to the global stage. It's amazing how these tiny tweaks can have such a huge impact when you understand how our brains work.
It makes you think, where else do we see this power of habits playing out?
Well, the success of social movements can be linked back to habits and how they spread through communities.
Really? I wouldn't have thought of that.
It's true. Think about the civil rights movement back in the 50s and 60s.
Such a pivotal moment in history.
It really was. And it wasn't just about those powerful speeches or acts of bravery, although those were important, of course.
There was something much deeper happening.
Exactly. A shift in those social norms and behaviors.
So you're saying figures like Martin Luther King Jr. were really good at using social habits to fuel the movement.
They were masters at it. They created these new routines like the freedom rides or the lunch counter sit-ins. And it gave people a way to participate.
It gave them a way to take action.
Exactly. And those actions became more than just protests. They became habits that reinforced the values of the movement.
They were creating a new normal.
Precisely. They were fighting for legal change, but they were also creating a new set of social habits that challenged the status quo.
And those habits spread like wildfire.
They did. And that's because they weren't formed in isolation. They were fueled by those social connections and that shared sense of purpose.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
One person's action inspires another and another.
It's the power of community in action.
So we're not just talking about individual behaviors here. We're talking about habits that shape entire societies and cultures.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Understanding how habits operate on a social level gives us insights into how movement starts, how norms evolve, and how large-scale change really happens.
You mentioned keystone habits earlier.
Right.
We talked about Paul O'Neill's focus on worker safety at Alcoa, but can you think of any keystone habits on a societal level?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about recycling programs.
Yeah.
When they first started, the idea of separating your trash probably seemed like a hassle.
Yeah, it was a big change for a lot of people.
But over time, it's become second nature for many of us. And this simple habit has had a huge impact on the environment.
It's amazing to think about how one small change can have such a ripple effect.
It's not just about recycling itself. It's about that shift in mindset. It's about taking responsibility for our planet.
So a keystone habit like recycling, it's not just about the action itself, it's about the values and beliefs it represents.
Exactly. It creates a foundation for other positive habits to take root.
This whole discussion is making me rethink my own habits. You know, it's not just about breaking bad ones or forming good ones, it's about understanding the forces that drive my behavior.
It's about becoming more intentional.
Exactly.
And that's one of the most empowering things about Duhigg's work. By understanding the science of habits, we gain a sense of control over our lives.
We realize we're not just puppets on a string.
Right. We have the power to shape our own destinies.
It's not about being perfect or changing everything at once. It's about making those small changes that can have a big impact.
Exactly. Remember, habits are built through repetition and consistency. So start small. Focus on one habit at a time and celebrate those wins along the way.
This has been so insightful, but before we wrap up, I want to go back to those ethical questions.
Oh, the limits of free will.
Yeah, the cases of Angie Bachman and Brian Thomas.
Tragic stories.
They really made me question how much control we really have over our actions.
They raise some uncomfortable truths about the power of habits and the gray areas of responsibility.
So how do we reconcile the power of habits with the idea of personal responsibility?
It's a complex issue, but I think the first step is acknowledging that habits play a huge role in our behavior, whether we realize it or not.
So we need to recognize that those ingrained patterns can sometimes override our best intentions.
Exactly. And by understanding the science of habits, we can start to come up with ways to mitigate those risks.
Like figuring out what triggers those unhealthy behaviors.
Exactly. And maybe we need to create systems that support those good habits and help people who are struggling with the bad ones.
It's about understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. We need to move beyond this idea of willpower and blame and recognize that habits are often shaped by a complex mix of factors.
So can habits really be changed?
That's the million-dollar question.
Is there hope for people who feel stuck?
There's always hope. One of the most encouraging things about habits is that they're not fixed. Our brains are constantly adapting and changing.
So even though it can be tough, it's possible to change those deeply ingrained habits.
Absolutely. It takes effort and patience. But with the right strategies and support, it can be done.
That's what's so empowering about understanding the power of habits. We realize we have more control over our lives than we might think.
It's about shaping our own destinies.
One step at a time. This has been such a thought-provoking conversation, but we're not done yet. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how these ideas play out on an even grander scale, examining the habits that shape our world and how we can use this knowledge to create a better future. We've talked about a lot with habits, the science, the cravings, belief, even those ethical dilemmas when habits go wrong. But I want to zoom out a bit. You mentioned habits, shaping societies, even the world. How so?
Well, it's like, think about it. Our political systems, our economies, even our cultures, they're all influenced by habits, both individual and collective. You know, the way we vote, the way we buy things, how we interact, it's all shaped by these patterns of behavior over time.
So to make a better world, more just sustainable, all that, we need to figure out how to shift those collective habits.
Exactly. It's a big challenge for sure, but not impossible. History's full of movements, big cultural shifts. Right. You know, they transformed those deep habits, created whole new norms.
Duhigg talks about the civil rights movement.
Yeah, right.
Those leaders, like Martin Luther King Jr., they didn't just change laws, they changed how people thought and felt.
They got it. They understood that real change, it's more than willpower or just politics. It's got to be a shift in those habits that drive our actions. And they were brilliant at using those social connections, those stories, collective action, you know, to create that shift.
So it wasn't just fighting injustice, it was building a whole new way of life. Those routines, those rituals, that showed what equality and justice really meant.
Exactly, like the Montgomery bus boycott.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about not riding the bus. It was that new habit of solidarity, a new way of living that challenged the power structure.
And those new habits didn't just appear overnight. It took consistent action, the stories, the belief in a shared goal.
Right, and that's key. Changing those big collective habits, it takes time. Patience working together is realizing we're all part of this bigger system. And even our small actions, they can create a ripple effect.
So for us as individuals, how do we use all this to make a difference?
I think it starts with just being aware. You know, understanding how habits work on a personal level, societal level. It changes how you see the world. You start to see those patterns that shape our lives and the forces behind them.
So being more mindful of our choices each day and how they fit into those bigger systems.
Exactly. And even small changes in our own habits, they can have a ripple effect.
Yeah.
like choosing to walk or bike instead of driving, buying local. It might seem small, but it all adds up to a shift towards sustainability.
And as we get better at seeing our own habits, maybe we can spot those keystone habits, the ones that can really make a difference.
Absolutely. Whether it's our health, our relationships, our communities, there are those key habits that can spark all sorts of positive change.
This has been eye-opening, really.
Yeah.
But before we finish, I want to touch on those ethical questions again. You know, the Angie Bachman case, Brian Thomas, they really make you think about free will and responsibility.
They do.
Yeah.
It's clear that habits, especially when those cravings are strong,
Yeah.
they can lead to consequences. We don't intend.
So how do we balance the power of habits with taking responsibility for our actions?
Tough question. No easy answers.
Yeah.
But I think acknowledging that habits play a big part, that's the first step,
Yeah.
whether we realize it or not.
So it's not about denying responsibility. It's about understanding how those ingrained patterns can sometimes take over.
Exactly. And by understanding the science, we can start to come up with ways to manage those risks.
Like recognizing what triggers those unhealthy behaviors.
Right. And maybe as a society, we need systems that support good habits and help people who are struggling with the bad ones.
It's about seeing the bigger picture.
It is.
Yeah.
We need to move past this idea of just willpower and blame and realize habits are complicated, shaped by a lot of things.
So can habits really be changed? Like, for good?
That's the question, isn't it?
Is there hope for people who feel stuck in those negative patterns?
There's always hope. One of the best things about habits is they're not set in stone. Our brains, they adapt, they change based on what we do.
So even though it's hard, it's possible to change even those really deep habits.
It is. It takes effort, patience. But with the right strategies, support, it can happen.
That's what's so empowering about all this. Understanding habits, we see we have more control than we thought.
We can shape our own lives.
One step at a time.
Exactly.
This has been a deep dive in every sense of the word. So much to think about. So much we can do. And that's it for our deep dive into the world of habits. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of habits. It's been a real eye-opener. And hopefully it's given you some food for thought, some inspiration to maybe start changing those habits that aren't serving you and embrace those that can help you create a better life for yourself and maybe even a better world for all of us.